I want to talk a bit about the hard policy areas. So we've talked about all this stuff, how advanced countries grow, kind of what these high growth cases taught us. We talked about urbanization. We talked about getting rid of bottlenecks. We talked a little bit about financial sector development, and I'll come back to that. And we talked about the kind of, as a kind of illustration, the picture, the pattern in China and India. So I think we're sort of up to about here. Now, so you can think of this as kind of a discussion that has to do with the question, if that's all there is to it, then why aren't there 150 countries growing at high rates as opposed to 15 and a few others accelerating? And the answer to that, of course, is sort of obvious. It's a lot harder than that. And it's harder on the political side. It's harder on the economic side in a few areas that are fairly difficult to get one's arms around. And frankly, are areas that people argue about and disagree about even now. So that's what I'd like to talk about at the start of today. And then maybe, if we have time, I'd like to get to this question of, how did the crisis impact both the economies of the developing world, how well did they react, and how did it affect their thinking, about what we thought we were learning in the last 15 years as we go along. So what I've listed here, and by the way, feel free to pipe up, but I guess you're going to have a mic, when you do. But these are the areas that, at least in the work that we did, that we identified as having difficulties, meaning being complex, where there wasn't sort of a simple answer. Industrial policy refers to interventions at a fairly microeconomic level to try to accomplish something. Usually that is economic diversification, especially in the export sector in the early stages of growth, because people believe correctly, based on experience, that economic diversification, rapid incremental change in productive employment opportunities, and accessing global demand through diversification in the export sector is an important part of that. And think of it this way, you're a well-intentioned policymaker and you're sitting there and you've done all the right things, ticked off every box on the Washington Consensus list. Low inflation, stable macroeconomic environment, nice statistics with respect to doing business, and you understand this growth engine, and it's not happening. So you've got two choices. You can say, well, that's our bad luck. We've done what we're supposed to do. Remember I told you about the two different approaches to economic sort of policy, which is one, keep at it until you get the results, and the other is get the policies right, and whatever happens must be the right answer because an economist somewhere who's famous said so. And so these policies are on the boundary, where you're acting to try to get something going or to keep it going, where we don't have good economic theories that are complete. We've got insights, that have to do with why is it that some of these things won't jumpstart by themselves under ordinary market incentives and forces. And industrial policy is probably the most controversial and the easiest to understand. A second one can be described in various ways, but it has to do with the question, okay, somebody came along and made a pretty convincing case that successful growth strategies are ones that are engaged with the global economy. Now let's get practical and ask, what does that mean? Does it mean drop all the tariffs to zero tomorrow? And if it doesn't mean that, because that sounds pretty dramatic and maybe risky, then how fast? And in what order? Are there sectors where it's kind of risky to open up to the global economy? So there's a set of questions that have to do with how you actually do that over time. And there's disagreements about that. So that's that topic. Same issue on the capital account. As you probably saw in some of the readings, my way of describing the advice pre-1995 that came from the international financial institutions to the developing economies was, on the capital account, you should look like us. What did that mean? It meant the capital account was open, the currency was convertible, meaning you could take it in and out, as much as you want, and the exchange rate was market determined. That means you didn't muck around with it. You didn't try to set it, and you didn't buy and sell your own currency a whole lot, in order to change it, lower the volatility, or a whole bunch of things like that. That, by and large, is no longer the rule, the rule of thumb that most people believe. So we're in a more complicated world in which most people, most knowledgeable practitioners and sort of analysts believe that that doesn't make sense, that there's risks associated with the open capital account strategy. And so the question is, well, what's the alternative? And it comes out sounding a little bit like the one on the current account or the trade account, which is if you don't do it overnight, then the question is, well, how fast, in what order? How do you open a capital account? What are the benefits and risks of doing that? Financial sector development, there was a slide back there. I may have gotten it out of order, but I'll talk a bit about that. And labor markets and potential blockages, if we have time. And finally, not very much on competition policy. So let's jump into this. Why is industrial policy so controversial? It's controversial because for two reasons, I guess. One, there's a significant subset of people who really still believe some version of the Washington Consensus, which is not necessarily the stripped-down version, stabilize, privatize, and liberalize, which is if you don't muck around at the microeconomic level, and I'll talk a little bit about the substance of what that means in a minute, but you do these other things right, then in fact you won't stall out. That is, there isn't anything else you have to do. And they would argue that when you look closely at case studies, there's usually something missing in the kind of underlying structure that causes people to start thinking about maybe we should do something else. I don't think that's probably right for a variety of reasons. But once you get into industrial policy, so let's talk a bit about what industrial policy means. Usually it is targeted at attracting foreign direct investment. These are not mutually exclusive categories. Diversifying, especially in the export sector, and a bunch of policies designed to do that. So let's take an example. In many of the successful developing countries, and in some of the unsuccessful ones, there is something called special export zones. Now, what is a special export zone? It's a physical area, usually, in a country that's set up to try to attract both domestic and foreign investment in industries that they think are within shooting distance of having a comparative advantage. And they have lots of characteristics. One, sometimes from some fairly specific infrastructure gets built that isn't just kind of available for the whole economy, like port facilities, like a resident customs operation that's reasonably efficient. Not uncommonly, there's favorable tax treatment. If that's temporary, then there are arguments why that might be a good idea to attract foreign investment, foreign direct investment, which means other companies coming in order to get the benefit of the technology transfer. There is frequently a holiday from tariffs, right? So if you go back to the open the current account, meaning open the economy, and realize you're not going to do it for the whole economy overnight, then you realize that tariffs can get in the way of developing or export diversification. Why? Because most developing countries in the early stages are doing a labor-intensive process, sort of assembly-type operation. And that's part of the supply chain. But in order to do that operation, you don't produce most of the inputs to that final stage of the production process in your own country. Or you can't reasonably expect to do that from the get-go. That means that most of these industries function on a lot of imports, followed by that portion of the value-added chain, and then a lot of exports. Okay? Now, if you raise the tariffs on those or leave them high, then that, diminishes the economic attractiveness. So what you see in special export zones is favorable tax treatment on the one hand, and the lowering of the tariffs. And the way that works is the physical product actually has to come into the export zone and go through the value-added chain and come out the other side. Otherwise, there's a leak, and you've effectively lowered. If it can come into the export zone and out into the economy, then you've effectively lowered the tariff for that class of goods for the economy. And there's entrepreneurs in most countries, they'll find a way to take advantage of that, right? So it's a combination of sort of subsidization, reducing what amounts to a barrier that ultimately will kind of go down anyway on the tariff side, the building of infrastructures to raise the rate of return on this investment. Sometimes there's some technical training, that associated with the labor force that's partly paid for on the public sector side. It sounds sensible, but in order to do this, you have to have a view about who you're trying to attract, right? You don't do this for sort of, industry in general. Then somebody comes along and says, well, we'll make, steppers, the kind of machinery the precision machinery that's made in Japan to make semiconductors. You'll probably should say no to that. And so the point of that is that when you get into this business, even though you may not want to, you're starting to insert views that aren't just coming from the market about what it is that ought to be there. You're making judgments about where your comparative advantage might lie, where that margin is that will attract that business. And that's where the critics jump in. And they say, yeah, but what is it, the main criticisms of this kind of strategy are three. One, there's cases where it's gone badly wrong and apparently just didn't work. Two, maybe more than three. Two, once you start subsidizing one of these things, they'll want the subsidies forever. And a subsidy that's required forever to keep the industry alive means that the original decision was a mistake. You are overcoming barriers if this strategy works and not solving a kind of permanent problem for an industry that shouldn't otherwise be there. Third, the argument is that the government people don't know anything about this and they'll just waste the money. And fourth, they'll argue that either at the start or later on, industry groups will be influential and they will influence the decisions, including the subsidy decisions, and you'll end up inevitably wasting resources anyway. So this is a highly controversial area. And so you get to choose. Now, most successful developing countries have at least dabbled or experimented with export promotion programs. And I think the reason is they came to understand, that there were errors and mistakes and wastage and whatnot that was possible in this context. But when the alternative was sitting back and watching either nothing happen or a very slow process of diversification, running those risks seemed to be the right thing to do. I think that's probably a pretty good, sensible sort of approach. My own view, for what it's worth, is there are benefits and risks, and they vary from context to context. On the benefit side, there's a clear externality that's informationally based for attracting the early new entrants into a market. They're usually called demonstration effects. Remember, the outsiders don't know all the parameters, notwithstanding economic theory, in which we assume everybody makes decisions with perfect information. Wrong. Doesn't actually happen in the real world. And so you've got a country where not much of this has been going on, and the external investors are looking at it, and they're saying, well, I don't know. This may or may not. There's an inevitable element of risk. And there's also discovery. And when somebody goes in there and sets up an operation whose parameters one can see, and it turns out to be successful, that has the effect of telling people how to do it and that it's successful. That has very large positive value because it'll be imitated, value that is not appropriated by the original investor. And so to promote that kind of experimentation, if you want to think of it that way, you can imagine that it's a reasonable argument, at least based on theory, that you want to subsidize the early entrants. Not everybody coming in, but the early entrants where the demonstration effect comes from. That's the main, I would say, the main argument on the part of Danny Roderick, probably the leading, almost certainly the leading development economist of his generation. There's another argument that's more complicated that has to do with the kind of microeconomic structure of industries and value-added chains. So I thought I'd tell you a bit about that. It's not in the reading. So Ricardo Hausmann, way back, about before most of you were born, Michael Porter wrote a book called The Competitive Advantage of Nations. And I'm sure none of you have read it. And in that book, which is massive, it's a huge empirical study, he went around and asked industry by industry on a global basis, where are the successful competitors? Now, you might think in a world where human talent and other things are scattered around the world that you'd find the successful competitors in many industries scattered around the world. Well, you don't. You find them in clusters, regionally, within countries, not a single country, but in regional clusters, to a surprising extent. So if you look at printing machines, big printing machines, you know, the kinds of things that print books and newspapers, you'll find most of the companies that do that in Germany. High-end ceramics, you'll find most of those companies in a couple of regions of Italy. Semiconductors, 2 or 3 places. Changes over time, okay? So the general notion that, you know, this can happen sort of anywhere, you know, is not, and is sort of consistent with sort of what you might think of as common sense with no structure imposed, turns out not to be right. And so, and there's all kinds of things that are like this. We get urbanization because proximity matters, right? And proximity, when you look at it, it means if you want a financial, you know, center, those people need to talk to each other every now and then. If you have a semiconductor or a Silicon Valley, you know, there's a lot of contact that is real contact. My colleague at Stanford, Jim Gibbons, who used to be the Dean of Engineering, said that, you know, technology and all this stuff is a body contact sport, like football. And I think it's true. So the question, so we know there's some structure that affects, you know, how these industries cluster. And it probably affects also diversification. So then Ricardo Hausmann comes along and says, well, why do some countries diversify in the export sector apparently almost effortlessly once they get started, and other ones don't? And what he discovered using fairly imaginative techniques with existing data is that if you go look at countries, then this takes sort of, you know, modern graphic techniques, so I'm not an expert at that. But what you find is that there's clusters of industries. And the way to think of clusters, you know, so you get a whole bunch of things that are related to apparel, you know, and things that involve sewing and whatnot. And you'll get another one that involves sort of electronics, consumer electronics products and the inputs to them, like this. And so that you go look at, in micro detail, at an economy, not only are things clustered physically, but they're clustered in this way. And what in a cluster, you should probably think of, they're defined, you know, in an empirical way. What things tend to go together when you look across countries. But the right way to think about it is shared elements of the value-added chain, okay? So in a lot of these industries, you know, if there's 6 steps in the value-added chain, and 3 of them they're the same as so going over here, then it's easier to move from one to the other because you already know how to do 3 of them, that kind of thing. There's a famous business school case from a well-known business school on the east coast of the United States about the diversification pattern of a company called Canon. And what way Canon diversified explicitly was to ask, you know, if we're making cameras, what are the components of the value-added chain, what products share those components, and which ones are logical for us to move to because we already know how to do them. I think McKinsey told them how to do this. Anyway, now it turns out that when you do the whole mapping, you'll get things like this: big clusters and then little clusters. And you can find economies, frequently ones with natural resource kind of history backgrounds, where if you look at the export sector, they're little clusters, and there's nowhere to go. Meaning, to get to another cluster, which creates a set of options in the normal investment sense with respect to diversification, you have to move a long way. Now, Ricardo Hausmann uses an unfortunate way of describing analogy, which I'm not going to repeat because I don't like the sound of it. But the idea is right, which is this jump, say if you're stuck here and you want to get over here because it sort of makes sense, is a long jump. It's sort of risky, and you may want to try to accelerate that kind of activity. And you may want to accelerate it by investing in technology or attracting foreign direct investors. So this is not something that we yet understand very well, in part because we don't have magnificent data on it, and partly because we haven't thought about it enough. But business people think about it. And there does appear to be economies that are sort of stuck, and when you look at their microeconomic structure, they seem to be stuck in small clusters where there's no obvious place to go, or it's a big, long leap to get from where you are to where you want to go. So that's another reason why people think about industrial policy. Now, what are the risks, I think, are implicit in what we've just talked about. The risks are associated with, well, where is the government's competence, the decision-making on the public sector resource side, come from? Is it really there? And if it's supposed to be there, where did it come from? Do you graduate from college, get a civil service thing, and know how to think about, your comparative advantage, or what? I mean, does it come from studying other countries? I mean, it's a question worth asking. Second, there's the risk of sort of this whole process being captured and used to promote the interests of domestic industries, or even existing export industries that have nothing to do with diversification and the intended goal. And my own view, just to kind of wrap up this discussion, you'll see more about it in the readings, and if you want to read, there's a lot of literature on it. My own view is that the risks vary from country to country, a fair amount, based on the way the government and the business community interact, and the kind of structure and the levels of competence. And so I don't think there's a single answer to this. I can think of environments in which I'd be very reluctant to kind of turn this loose. On the other hand, I'd be very reluctant to sit there and watch an economy kind of not diversify in the early stages of growth. So that's kind of where we are on this thing, but it's important, right? It would be nice if all the important subjects were ones that were clear-cut and the other ones didn't matter. It turns out that's not right, and that's why I think I said to you at the start, a lot of this has to do with making decisions under uncertainty in the way business people and investors do. And policy people are very uncomfortable with that, mostly, because of the way they're trained and because of the political costs of making a mistake. It's far more costly to do something and have it turn out badly than sit there on your hands, and say, well, no, I didn't do anything like that. All right. Now, the problem with sitting on your hands is, obviously the results may not be too good. So this is a tricky area, and policy people, effective governments, a very important dimension of effective governments is overcoming this conservative bias and being willing to conduct experiments that can be defended on a sensible benefit-cost calculation, knowing that sometimes it will go badly and you have to cut it off, right? And that is a capability that many, many governments do not have. It's partly because they haven't paid attention to it. It's partly because the natural reward system is asymmetric and penalizes kind of mistakes more than the opposite. Good results and a few good experiments with a bunch of failures that you had to cut off. I mean, you can see what goes on. And I think part of the challenge is getting the risk-taking, in a prudent kind of investment sense mindset into the government decision-making side, so it's a better match for the private decision-making side. But that's a huge challenge in any government, not just the developing world. So I think I've talked about this. You get informationally based market failures because there's externalities. The demonstration effects may not come as fast as you want. And so you should consider subsidizing those things essentially to increase the rate of experimentation. And you should not continue to subsidize, certainly not in a particular sector. So that means cutting off the mistakes. And these are draconian decisions. I mean, I was in St. Kitts, which is one of the Eastern Caribbean islands, when they cut off the sugar industry, which was costing them, I think it was $30 or $40 million a year. Unfortunately, the sugar industry employed about a third of the adult population of St. Kitts. Now, it's not a very large island, still a third of the adult population. This is a pretty gutsy decision, and they really didn't know what was going to replace it. They kind of hoped it would be service sectors and tourism and stuff like that. But they literally couldn't afford to keep doing this. What you really want to do is cut it off a bit before that so you don't keep pouring the resources into the system. Now, I cite that example only because it's very easy for Mike Spence to say, in a nice classroom in the beautiful city of Milan, cut off the lousy experiments until you actually have to do it. On the ground and put all those people out of work. Okay, second, I think I've talked about this. Industrial, special export zones, targeted infrastructure, training institutions, inputs. The inputs that come typically from a combination of the private and public sector that don't appear in our simple models where the private sector does it all. And here I think I just wrote down on a slide this plea for pragmatism and adopting the kind of benefit-cost sort of approach and developing the ability to approach it that way. Management of the capital account. I think all of you have studied a little bit of macroeconomics. This subject, I don't want to spend too long on it, but it can get pretty technical. But it turns out it's very important. I mean, the list of sort of tragedies, and crises that go with shocks combined with mismanagement of the capital account is a very, very long list. And so, vulnerability on this front to imbalances, excessive debt, all kinds of things that can go wrong, is pretty important part of our growth and development strategy. So what is the capital account? The capital account is basically the place where capital flows in and out of the country and where the exchange rate is determined by the supply and demand. There are two primary ways to manage the capital account. Obviously one way is to leave it open, to say any inflow and any outflow is fine, and we're not going to intervene in the buying and selling of our currency. So whatever the market-determined exchange rate is, that's what it is. We'll live with it. That exposes you to high-speed inflows and outflows of capital based on shocks that are both external, like the one we just had. I'll show you later what happened to the capital in the developing countries. When the balance sheets collapsed in the United States and to some extent in Europe, was pretty breathtaking. I'm not sure you'd want to sort of say, oh, that's fine. All the capital's leaving. The exchange rate's plunging. So most countries don't do this, frankly. It leads to excessive risk and excessive volatility in the exchange rate. Volatility in the exchange rate means it's hard to predict for investors on what basis they'll be doing business with the rest of the global economy, right? And that adds to risk. So despite the fact that up until about 1998, the advice to developing countries is open up the capital account, most countries didn't. They intervened in different ways and in different patterns. But for the most part, these are countries that have capital controls on the one hand, and they vary across classes of capital, and they intervene in the markets for their own currency. That is, they intervene in the exchange rate. So what do they actually do? Here's a general sort of pattern. I'll get it. It's my wife. Here's what they generally do. They allow foreign direct investment because it's considered all good. They put barriers of a variety of kinds in the way of inbound capital flows, particularly if they're of short duration and can exit easily, the so-called hot money, because that's a source of volatility. If they're smart, they limit debt denominated in foreign currencies for the reasons we talked about a couple of times ago. All right, so that's another barrier. You know, don't borrow, folks, government or private, in dollars or euros, for example, because we're, as a developing country, too vulnerable to having our exchange rate adjust downward, and those liabilities will become very big very fast. So that tends to be off the table now. And many countries intervene in the currency markets and accumulate reserves. So I need to just say a word about that so you understand it. There's lots of examples of this. China has the biggest set of reserves, but most countries have done this. And they do it for two reasons. It's part of managing exchange rate volatility, you know, because you're intervening when it's sort of shooting up, and you can actually sell it when it's shooting down. So reserves are a form of self-insurance against volatility. Now, what developing countries get told by the IMF and others is that's a very expensive form of self-insurance. We should do this collectively. I mean, we don't all self-insure our houses or our apartments against damage from fire and water. We pool the risks, right? The trouble is the international pooling system hasn't worked very well so far. And until it's pretty bulletproof, countries are going to self-insure. And I can assure you that we're not going in the direction of pooling them right now. After this crisis, which we entered with the IMF having $250 billion to stabilize the currencies of God knows how many countries, developing countries were very sure it was a good idea, the ones that had reserves to have reserves, to manage this process on their own. So self-insurance is alive and well and takes the form of reserve accumulation. The other reason for accumulating reserves is if the rest of the world gets very excited about the growth opportunities in your economy and capital starts flooding in, they'll drive your exchange rate up. And by driving it up, they'll reduce the competitiveness of the export sector. And while you don't want to resist that entirely, because those capital flows are coming in for a reason, that's part of the market adjustment process, it can be excessive and cause not just volatility, but actually sort of putting you out of business too fast. And the capital markets are not in the business of employing all of your population. They're chasing returns and opportunities, and they'll invest to the point where they close them down at the margin, and you may not want them closed down at the margin. So there's a clear potential divergence between social and private objectives that will cause a sensible policy of intervention. Having said that, you know, having an undervalued currency is not a growth strategy. I want to say this clearly, right? It may look like it's a growth strategy because it makes your export sector more competitive, but it will also slow down the structural change. It will lower productivity growth, and it makes everything the rest of the world makes it more expensive for your citizens, okay? And if you keep having to push your exchange rate down relative to others to stay competitive, then eventually you'll stall out the growth and be relatively poor. And that lesson has been learned several times, over and over again. I grew up in Canada. And Canada had a policy. Canada is this small country of 30 million people just north of the United States. And and the United States is about 300 million people. You know, you take all those numbers when I was growing up and multiply by 2/3. So it was 200 million and 20 million. But very bright people, I might add. And Canada thought, well, we ought to have a mini version of the United States. You know, so we're not dependent. We're kind of, they don't pay particular attention to us, but you know, we're going to make cars and everything, just like they do. And the way Canada did that, and the way many countries do it, is we put up tariff barriers to compensate for the cost advantage that the big market had in a number of industries. And we said, well, they weren't that high at the start. And then over time, as these big industries got bigger and got more and more efficient, the tariff barriers that were required to protect the domestic industry went up and up and up. And when Canada and Australia and New Zealand, all of whom were doing this, abandoned the policies, the effective rates of protection, that is the percentage rate by which you had to increase the cost of the imported good to make your domestic industry competitive, was 85% in many industries. 85%. You almost had to double the price of the import in order to kind of make your domestic industry competitive. And at some point, people get up in the morning and say, oh, wait a minute, this might not be the best strategy. Why don't we specialize a little bit in stuff we're really good at and stop trying to make everything? And so this is, in any economy that's small, this strategy eventually kind of costs you dearly. So managing the current account in the wrong way and managing the exchange rate as the main competitive weapon, as opposed to investment, human capital, economic diversification, and the stuff in that growth engine, that's all. And that's, by the way, why the old adage was, don't do this, you know. You'll end up doing the wrong thing rather than the right thing. And the more nuanced version of that is it's true. It's possible to do the wrong thing on the capital account, either trying to make yourself competitive or doing something like that, also on the current account. But there are very good reasons for doing this. Final thought on this subject is, there was a tendency to think that a developing country was a country that needed all kinds of development in public institutions in the private sector, but the financial sector was fully developed. Well, when you think about it, that's crazy, right? Why would the financial sector be fully developed when the rest of them are in the business of getting to a mature, advanced state and deepening their capabilities? And in truth, what's happening in development is all the institutions and markets and whatnot are becoming more mature and deepening their capabilities. So if you expose an early stage financial system to high-speed capital inflows and outflows and other things, turns out you're creating risk. And I think that's widely understood now. That leaves the question, how fast and in what order do you do this? And that's at about the boundary of what we know now. So we don't have a rule book, and we don't have a set of particularly detailed guidelines right now for how to do this. We've got a bunch of experience. I think the opening on the foreign direct investment is right, even though it will meet with domestic resistance from domestic, is right. Having some practical constraints on hot money flows of a variety of forms. You can tax them the way Chile does. You can just block them. There are a variety of ways to control the speed in and out. You can tax them and say the tax will decline if you leave it here for a while. I mean, there's lots of, you'll see lots of variety in the world. But that's kind of where we are on the capital account. I'll say more about the Chinese one in a minute. It's by far, and I think this is probably most, I covered this already. And I think I covered that too. Okay. I changed gears a little bit. I don't think I want to talk, forever about these things. There's a fair amount of writing on it in the papers that were written for the Growth Commission. So if you're interested or it intersects the topic you're doing, there's lots of, those are kind of avenues or doors to kind of get in and start to take a look at it. All right, so we want to try to spend a little time talking about the countries that aren't growing. Obviously, it's a declining group, but it's pretty big. It's certainly big in terms of numbers. And so there's nothing automatic about this process. Despite the fact that, it looks like once you understand it, it's pretty clear what's supposed to happen. So the question is, what do we know about this And the reason for being interested in it, other than, you know, curiosity and the fact that it affects the lives of lots of people, you can think of this as, in the G20 terms, as an augmented G20 would have 65 to 70% of the world's population, account for most of the growth, and account for 85 to 90% of the global output in income. So that leaves another 30% of people who are generally in low growth environments or ones that have stalled out, and with a very small fraction of the global GDP, somewhere between 10 and 15%. So it's a lot of people whose well-being depends on somebody understanding, presumably they're citizens and leaders, you know, what's the problem here? What's the bottleneck? Why are we not growing? This turns out to be kind of a difficult subject, and it's not all economics. So I'll just say a few words about it, and then, you know, I'll be happy to entertain sort of questions. When I looked around on the economic side, at the most plausible reasons over time for low growth, there were a relatively small number. In the early days, meaning for much of the post-war period up until the last 15 or 20 years, macroeconomic instability would be an important deterrent. And it was deterrent by virtue of the fact that it caused inflation and eventually investment risk, to the point that there were better places to invest than these countries. Now you can say the risk premia on whatever the investment vehicle is can go up and you can still attract funds, but that makes it awfully expensive. So I would say loss of macroeconomic control, and probably underneath that, competence in monetary and macroeconomic management, which is a skill like anything else that everybody's been learning over time, would be an important explainer of this. The good news is once you understand it, you can do something about it. The bad news is that it takes time to do something about it, because investors don't say, oh, I see, now you've learned your lesson, this won't happen again. They wait. And they wait and they wait and they wait until there's some track record. And the waiting's painful, right? The other thing, you know, the flip side of that coin is you don't want to have a crisis, partly because it slows you down badly, you know, sets you back 25% in GDP sometimes. But in addition, it has this other effect. And I mention these things because I want you to sort of think about them. There are long-term consequences to things, you know, that where somehow expectations, positive expectations, get damaged. So, for example, the outbreak of violence in Kenya after the last election was very unfortunate. Not just, I mean, principally, of course, because the political system stopped functioning and a lot of people got killed, but also because it created an enormous increment in risk from the point of an investment point of view for domestic and foreign investors. That can set a country back 10, 15 years before you can't overcome that overnight, is what I'm trying to say. And so you can't necessarily prevent it, but at least if people are aware that there's a collective cost of that kind of instability, whether it has an economic source or another one, I would say you might, at the margin, reduce the risk that it will actually occur. The second observation is that if I had to explain on the economic side, that is the economic contribution to low growth, I would say it's some combination of underinvestment and ineffective or inefficient investment on the public sector side in the things that are most important, which are infrastructure and education. And so on the size, I think we talked about it, we came to the conclusion that you needed to be in the 5 to 7% range. At the high end, you'll see countries like China that are somewhere around 11% of GDP in terms of public sector investment. But if you get down to 2 to 3%, it just doesn't look like you're creating the complementary assets to the private sector assets fast enough to keep kicking up the rate of return on incremental private sector investment. So the engine starts to lose value. Why would you underinvest in these things? Answer, probably because it's, well, two possible answers. One, I think in some places their importance in stimulating private sector investment via raising the return is not understood completely, though that's less true as time goes on. And second, the intertemporal cost right now of making large investments in the future is high, and the political system may simply decide one way or another through the government fiscal and budgetary process and the electoral process not to do it. And countries are very different in that respect. And I would not want to stand up here and tell you that we are absolutely, 100% equipped with well-developed theories supported by evidence that tell us when's this going to happen and not. I mean, it's a kind of bit of a blizzard of stuff. But I think at least I'm right that if you forget about the why for a moment, the what is that a lot of countries are just underinvesting on the public sector side, and you can't run the engine that fast, if that element of fuel isn't being input at a higher rate. Yeah. Do you want to? That could have been a sore arm, but I thought it might be a question. Okay. So on the economic side, those are the two most important things that I encountered. On the political side, it's much more complicated. You've read or listened to Paul Collier and some other analyses. This I think is this work, which is generally thought of under a variety of hats as political economy. That is the interaction of political structures and decision-making with economic structures and decision-making probably is much more important than the purely economic part. So I want to just chat a bit about that without pretending, again, that we know a lot about it. I mean, that is, we have definitive theories. So what do we know? We know that countries have sort of natural disadvantages. We used to think it was absence of natural resource wealth back in the 50s and 60s, as I mentioned last time, and now we don't sort of think that anymore. We think, educated human beings are probably a more important and durable form of wealth and wealth creation. That's kind of mixing up the means and the ends, but you understand what I mean. So I think we've gotten over that bias. But natural resource wealth, which Jeff Sachs originally, I think, labeled a curse, does seem to be an important negative explanatory variable. And the reason appears to be that it turns the political process, even a democratic one, into a game that is more focused on capturing an outsized portion of the wealth, as opposed to creating for the future a whole lot of wealth, which is what growth is about. And so the whole political process gets engaged in capturing and holding on to the wealth. And what form does that take? Well, it takes staying in power, so you get your hands on the wealth, and you have some military and police support, and you buy a lot of votes, and and you get enough people on your side, and then you win the election, and you stay in power. And everything we associate with sort of a democratic process sort of goes wrong. It's like a pathology. It's got the form of a democratic structure, without, and there's lots of versions of that you can read about in various kind of case histories. So that looks like it's a real risk. And it not only looks like it's a real risk, but it's not clear how to get out of it. So when we looked at this, one of the things that we realized early on, which I think is widely understood anyway, it wasn't a particularly brilliant sort of discovery or insight, is that for the most part, when a problem develops like that, it's going to take some leadership to coalesce, citizen opinion around a change, whether it's going to be violent or involve regime change or just change in behavior and kicking the scoundrels out, varies. But the important point is that it almost surely has to come from within. That is, you very, very rarely see a case in which an external intervention, solves a problem like this. Now, I want to be careful. There are times when external interventions have a very big effect, and they tend to be in the cases of conflict or humanitarian disasters. So I want to be careful. I'm not talking about the importance of not having external interventions. But external interventions that are designed to fix a governance problem are not well received, usually, even in poor countries. These people want to govern themselves. And I actually think that's probably a good thing, but it leaves you with the problem. Well, if the system's not working very well, and a whole bunch of people are intimidated, and a whole bunch of other people seem to have an ironclad grip on the resources sufficient to sustain themselves via a bunch of transmission mechanisms in power, then what's going to cause it to change? And I think the answer to that is sometimes not much. So, fire away.
Oh, so I was reading,
Oh, Mike? Well, I have to tell you a story while you're getting a mic. So when the Growth Commission was working, we had workshops, and they were all recorded, and everybody had to speak into the mic, and usually we had one of those things with a button on it. And we had a really obnoxious person transcribing everything we said. And so whenever anybody failed to turn on the mic, they'd say, "Mic, please." And that was fine, except when they said it to me, and I'd say, "Yes." I finally got it. Go ahead. Yeah.
So I was reading an article, I think fairly recently, about a company in Africa that is sponsoring kind of a prize for any African leader who kind of comes to power, then hands over, I guess, in a democratic process, their power. So they give them $5 million and like $200,000 for life or something like that, in kind of an effort to, I guess, stabilize the government.
Shift the incentive.
Yeah, so I was wondering if that's kind of like a possibility that would help these countries rich with natural resources kind of give up control of that structure.
Well, it's certainly worth a try. Is that Mo Ibrahim's effort? He's the biggest telecommunications executive.
I think it was a telecommunications.
I think it's Mo Ibrahim, yeah. He's very well known and for good reason. Yeah, that's a very promising line of attack, and may require some modification to the notion that external intervention is not probably going to be successful. I think that's probably right. The other thing that when things are pathologically going the wrong way, it's hard to know how an external force can reverse trend. But you can certainly operate on the incentives at the margin, and that looks like it's one such effect. There are other forces in the world. So if you go back to the early days after World War II, where virtually nobody had television, it was just starting to spread in the advanced countries, then probably the most powerful mechanism for discovering how other people live was missing. I mean, there was radio and whatnot, but, wasn't that good, and that's verbal, you don't really see it. And there were telephones, but in most of the developing world, there were no cell phones. I know this sounds strange to some of you, but there were no cell phones. Landlines are unbelievably expensive, so, 1 every 100 people had a landline, and nobody else had been near a telephone in their life. The power of modern communications technology to deliver kind of full face, an image of how other people live, including better than you, is very, very large now, and a complete change from what we lived with before. And it's probably, in the end, pretty powerful because, if people live badly but don't think there's any other way, they have different attitudes than if they are constantly bombarded. Even if there's not a complete understanding of how you get from where we are to be where they are, if you're bombarded with this, as somebody eventually will stand up and ask the question. And there's all kinds of examples of this. I grew up in Quebec, and I'm not in Quebec in Canada, but in Quebec, which persistently threatens to secede from Canada because of poor treatment in the hands of the English-speaking majority, kind of discovered their resentment in the age of television. because in some sense it was like a developing country cut off from the rest of the world until it became evident. And the same effect shows up with leaders. I mean, it is alleged, although I don't think we have any way to prove this, that Deng Xiaoping's visit to Singapore, because the Chinese were completely cut off, to Singapore and then New York to go to the United Nations, was an important eye-opener in terms of what could actually happen in an economy. And that didn't guarantee success or tell them what formula to use or whatever. But I mean, these things really do actually have an effect. So I think it's wrong to be entirely pessimistic. The other thing that external forces can do is when things change direction and move in the right direction, is to move with extreme speed and effectiveness to be supportive so as to maximize the chances that the new direction, if it's the right one or a promising one, will actually work via heavy levels of investment, access to capital, a whole bunch of things, access to expertise, and so on. So you may have to wait a little bit for the situation to turn around internally, but then you're certainly not helpless with respect to external availability of resources and support. So I think the notion that it has to come from within may make it sound worse than it is. Finally, crises appear to be important. When lots of people, both practitioners and researchers, sort of reflect on this question of when is a change occur, it looks like crises they're not a surefire change in the right direction, but they sure look like they create opportunities. And the reason is, presumably, that the entrenched resistance declines after a crisis because kind of everybody's hurt from it. So the natural forces of inertia in any political system that kind of get in the way of changing the system get broken down to some extent. And so, on the Growth Commission, one of the members was a man named Kemal Dervis. He was the head of the UNDP for a while, but he's Turkish. And he was called in to be finance minister in Turkey's crisis back, around 2000, something like that. And he said they pushed through something on the order of 54 major reforms in the financial system in a matter of 18 months in Turkey, reforms that people had wanted to do for years that just couldn't get done. So that would be an example of that. And I think external crises and even internal, meaning ones that amount to shooting yourself in the foot, can do that. That is, a crisis can be things have just gotten so bad that, that people decide this really isn't working. So lots of people, I think including me, think that one of the reasons for the very sudden change in direction in China in 1978 was a feeling on the part of the Communist Party that if they kept this up, meaning this economic performance up, notwithstanding a reservoir of goodwill, they're actually going to lose the game, where the game meant staying in power and pursuing the revolution, whatever that means, to its logical end. And so, and I bet that, in the interviews that are now being conducted with the ones who were involved in that before they die, they'll be asked, could you have done that 10 years before? They probably will say, no, I don't think so. You've got to kind of get to the point where people really generally believe that it's not that good. This isn't a very optimistic message when you think about it. It means if you're going in the wrong direction, it's got to get really bad, and then you can change it. But I think there's some truth to it. At least based on experience and listening to a lot of people with relevant experience. So that would be the kind of crisis transformation mechanism that you see. There's all kinds of implications to that when you think about it. If things things that should be done are more difficult to do when things are going well, even though that's the right time to do it, buying yourself insurance of a variety of kinds, when you can afford to do it, in terms of excess capacity in multiple dimensions, overeducated workforce, all reserves, pick any dimension you want. tend to be invested in. The world, no matter how much we talk about it, is not really kind of built. Its DNA doesn't allow it to be countercyclical in a real kind of fundamental sense. And I live in California, or I used to. And I still have a house there. And I go back and see if it's still there every now and then. And California is the most pro-cyclical state, I've ever been in. Every time there's a boom, this is going to go on forever. The budget expands, The housing bubble goes out, beyond what you'd expect in other places. And sure enough, then when the turnaround comes, there we are. There's hard parts of this that we'll come to when we talk to the crisis, but I'll mention one now while we're on this subject. It's not always easy to be countercyclical. When things are going well, you have to know why they're going well. So let me give you an example. Coming into the crisis, the one that originated in the US and spread, Spain had a surplus, a central government surplus of some substantial magnitude. And nobody, including they, thought they were behaving irresponsibly fiscally. And then the crisis came and went, and now they have a huge deficit. Why? Because they had a surplus based on an economy that was running on kind of, a bubble economy, asset inflation. And when that kind of went away. Now, when you think about it, so it's pretty obvious when you look back what happened. But if you ask yourself the more fundamental question, if you were in charge and somebody asked you in Spain 5 years ago, in 2005, when things were going swimmingly, is this really, are we really in trouble here? Most people would have said no. And they would have been wrong. And the reason is, in order to know whether you're in trouble, on the fiscal side, you have to know whether your economy is out of balance. And the revenues and the asset values are really unreal. And none of us knows how to do that, as far as I know. I haven't heard anybody recently, certainly nobody with a modest-sized ego, stand up and say, I can predict asset bubbles, or tell you when they're happening and why. So there's actually, in terms of kind of fundamental sort of theory and whatnot, there's actually a problem. It's not just in the financial sector, it spills over to the fiscal side. So that would be kind of an example of this sort of thing. There are a bunch of ways you can fail. I think, in the category of underinvestment in education and infrastructure, the only one I would call out, in addition to what we've already talked about, is the educational effectiveness challenge in many countries, both advanced and developing. The trends are declining, meaning per unit of something, whatever the currency is, of inputs, the outputs in terms of real outputs, that is cognitive skills and things like that, look like they're declining and on a ratio basis, and that's not good. It's true in the United States. I think it's true in a number of advanced countries as well. So I think this list is not comprehensive, but reasonably good. Let me say a word about the last two. We know the knowledge transfer process is important, and this is an area in which, if you go and sort of ask, what do we really know about this process in detail? What are the transmission channels? How do they work? The answer is we don't know nothing. Sorry, that sounds illiterate, but it's not true that we know nothing. But it certainly doesn't amount to kind of having a lock on it. So we know that foreign direct investment is usually associated with knowledge transfer, but not always. We know that how those things are structured has something to do with it, whether they're joint ventures, whether the investing enterprise, views it as in their interest to recruit and train people locally, citizens, and eventually turn the operation over to them. It depends on whether the government is willing to keep their economy open once they've acquired the knowledge. The single biggest bone of contention now between the advanced countries and China is not the exchange rate, and it's not intellectual property. It's the process of transferring technology in and then, according to the mumbling, right, and then starting to lose access to the domestic market in those products. And if that's going on, it actually probably ought to stop sooner rather than later, because that's the sort of thing that'll cause things to break out in a trade war. There's at least two countries, well, one very important country that didn't allow foreign direct investment for many years. Do you know who it was? Which one it was? I mean one that's growing. North Korea? Burma? No, it was Japan. So Japan managed to do a combination of import and create an enormous amount of technology without foreign direct investment. And Korea, to some extent, followed that kind of model for historical accidental reasons. President Park, who was a dictator at the start and largely responsible for jump-starting the Korean process, was in the military before. And the Japanese occupied Korea before World War II, for many years, actually. I think in 1913. And Park, you know, so he kind of grew up in that environment and ended up knowing a whole lot of Japanese people who became industrialists. And those relationships translated into a learning process with respect to policy, growth strategy, that led Korea. But it's still a bit of a mystery, actually, you know, how it's not that, you know, nobody wants to say that the knowledge and technology transfer process didn't work, but it worked without one of the most important transmission channels that we know. Foreign education, obviously, has something to do with this. It's very important. When I was a young faculty member at Harvard, I remember I had, you know, lots and lots of Korean PhD students. The Chinese came later. And I remember asking them, they're brilliant, but they all wanted to be business people. And I said, well, what are you doing here? And they said, well, what do you mean, what are we doing? And I said, well, you know, this is kind of an economics program, PhD, and maybe you should get an MBA. And they said, well, no, but we'd have to pay for that. So it was conscious policy. The Korean students, brilliant, you know, like your colleagues here, from many countries, you know, came to the United States, but they really couldn't afford, you know, the professional education. And so they weren't accustomed to borrowing that much and weren't sure they could pay it back once they went home. And so the government suggested that most of them should get economics PhDs, which many of them did. And then went on to successful careers in business, using absolutely none of the economics training. I'm being a little bit facetious, but so this is an area in which many of you will be involved if you're involved in multinational business and there's nothing that's more important, but it's not an area that we understand. The final thing I'll say is something that's really a very difficult area that does get in the way. We've kind of adverted to it in talking about dual labor markets in some places. So here's the problem. Many countries, not just developing ones, have institutions that in a variety of ways restrict the flexibility and mobility in the labor market. We know in general that that will cause problems with competitiveness and growth, because we know that lots of incremental people coming into the labor markets early on and lots of constant change later on is an important part of this. So in general, this kind of flexible labor market that's found a way to protect people without mucking up the labor market openness and flexibility is important. Now, what actually goes wrong? Well, one of the things that I observed, and I didn't expect to see this, when you actually go look in a number of countries, what you find is a labor market structure that's something like this. There's a formal labor market that typically is populated with, you know, institutions like unions that protect, you know, workers' rights, and the wages are relatively substantial compared to the surround in those places, and frequently the unions are politically powerful, and the people who work in the formal sector are relatively happy. And then there's another sector in which, or sectors called informal, in which many people work, frequently the majority. The estimates are in India that the people who are working in the formal sector are 6% of the total employed. And the remainder are somewhere else. Small businesses, countryside, so on. Hard to generalize about. Now, now what happens when a company, a multinational, comes along into one of these markets and starts assessing whether this is an interesting investment opportunity from the supply chain point of view, or the domestic market, or both? And they look, and almost always a multinational has to enter the formal sector, right, by law. All right? You can't come in and say, I'm disappearing into the countryside to employ some people and not pay taxes and whatnot. Doesn't happen. The problem with that is that frequently the attraction to a multinational is the underemployed population in the informal sectors. And so the structure creates a barrier between, you either come into the formal sector and then you're in that environment with those incomes and wages and so on, and you take a look around and say, well, there's a better place to do this. We'll go, excuse me, elsewhere. And so I thought a lot about this. So, it turns out the instinct that economists and policymakers have is, well, we've got to break down these barriers, kind of open the labor markets up. That's frequently politically a losing strategy, right? To take on, the political power that's inherent in the institutions that operate in the formal, and not to mention the people who are quite happy to be there. Basically, when you go to reform the labor markets, what you're saying to the people in the formal sector is, we've got a great deal for you. There's 35 million people out there who'd like to compete for your job. They can't now, and we're going to let them. How do you feel about that? And they say, not so good. And maybe we won't let that happen. And so the trick is, and economists hate this, is you need another track. If you can create a way for people who are seriously interested in employing people in the informal sector to employ them without threatening the people in the formal sector, another track of some kind, then you won't get the same resistance. But it's a messy situation. And people are still thinking about this, but I'll just go out on a limb. I think it's the right answer. I think, running at the thing head on, and you'll get a very bad headache and you'll lose. Running at the thing from the point of view, we're going to try to figure out a way to employ other people, sort of by going around the formal sector with government oversight and control so people don't get exploited, right? And with explicit agreement with the government, and well-intended government who actually wants these people to have access to the incremental employment opportunities. And then what will happen over time is those markets will merge. My colleague at Harvard, way back, Richard Friedman, one of the best labor economists, said, you know what happens in these economies? They all have excess labor supply, and the institutions are designed to protect the incumbents. Take away the excess labor supply and turn it into excess demand, and these sectors will merge, right? Because it won't matter anymore. Right? The differentials will be bid up. People will hop from one sector to another based on opportunity. So the trick is to think of this as a transition where you're trying to attract enough economic activity that you're creating a labor market environment in which there's a tendency toward excess demand and not a huge amount of excess supply. But that's a long journey, right? Remember, the starting point is 80% of the people are in the countryside, and it's populated by, or characterized by, a huge amount of underemployment, right? So the surplus labor condition is endemic. That's what it means to not have started growing for most countries, right? So it turns out these labor market institutions are kind of at the core of how the mechanism works, at least an important part of how that engine works. And if they're structured in a certain way, it will make it very difficult to get the engine running in a competitive world where these companies, the external employers anyway, have lots of places to go. On that same subject, I would say, just under the heading of things are competitive, big countries have a big advantage, even if they're a little bit screwed up as places to do business. And the reason is if they have some promise, that is, they're not really stuck, then they will attract external investment in part because of the future promise of the domestic market. And the small country can't, it's just not an option, right? If you're a country of 2 million and you're an island, and you say to foreign direct investors, it may be a little tough at the start, but then you have access to our huge domestic market, forget it. Whereas China and India, and Brazil and a number of other countries can say it. So it really is a very, once you're sort of on this track, a very big advantage to size. Because it increases your competitive position in competing for economic activity, in part because, of the future promise, conditional on growth of your domestic market. So let me pause there and say, see if there are any other comments or questions. I know you don't like using the mic, but I appreciate hearing from you. See, what time is it? Oh, it's 5 to 6. All right, I'm going to accelerate next time. We will talk about the crisis, a little bit about leadership, just a small amount more. We'll talk about the crisis and why the developing countries survived so well. We'll talk about the middle income transition with special reference to China, because I'd really like you to understand that part. That's going to turn out to be kind of a crucial part of the global economy. And then I think before the end, on the last day, we'll kind of have a general conversation with each other about the shifting structure of the global economy. And I will show you a little bit about what's happening to the structure of the American economy. Now, I would love to be able to do this either for Italy or for all the advanced countries, but we don't have the data. So I'm trying to talk the McKinsey Global Institute and a few other places, because this is a massive data collection exercise, in doing this for all the major economies in the world. But so far, 2 people, namely me and Sandile Hletzweil, my research assistant, have done it for 1 country. So, and I think you'll find it sort of startling what's been going on and how it's responding to the shifting structure of the global economy, driven primarily by the rapid rise in size and income and positioning in terms of the value-added chain of the emerging economies. And then I'll wish you well. Look forward to reading your papers and hope you all can solve all these problems while I'm sitting on a beach somewhere in a decade or so. Anyway, that's it for today. We'll see you all. And those of you who haven't sort of sent me something on the paper, or even if you told me tonight, just send me a short email saying this is what I'm doing. I'll give you any quick comments I have, but they all sound like they're pretty sensible, so go with it. The one, if you're going to pick the broader one, pick it in a specific place. It can be a country or region, but don't talk about it generally, because you'll end up with, on the one hand, on the other hand, and you'll end up sounding like an economist. Okay, ciao.